Again, on this perfect marriage thing, it seems like right now, yes, everything lines up perfectly in the sense that China needs energy. The Gulf has lots of energy. Europe is buying less energy because it's moving into kind of a post-fossil fuel phase, but China too wants to move into a post-carbon phase. What does the world look like in 20 years? When China is moving to electrify its industry and its transportation and its economy faster than almost any other country in the world, maybe it doesn't need that energy anymore from the Persian Gulf that it gets so much from today. What does the relationship look like down the road in this new era that China itself is pioneering?
This is a very interesting question. And I think the short answer is, in my view, a lot of Chinese officials don't believe that energy transformation China is going through will mean necessarily a complete phase out of oil and gas in the trajectory of fueling the future of the Chinese economy. So by that virtue, I think Gulf countries will remain very, very important strategically for China. The second component here is the Chinese leadership, I think, still think that a possibility to move on Taiwan is there. And if that happens before this energy transformation happens, I think the Gulf countries will prove that they are very, very strategically important together with other countries like Russia, for example. So the uncertainty about the future of the geopolitics in South China Sea and the Indo-Pacific, combined with the uncertainties around the Chinese economy, with the downturn now we are seeing in the property sector and unsustainable debt in the declining domestic demand in China, make the calculations of Chinese leadership still being focused on fueling their economy with traditional forms of energy until this insufficient renewable energy sources are up and running enough to wire the whole economy in China. Another factor is that I agree with Carlotta that Western investments are very important in the Gulf and sometimes eclipse the Chinese economic interests. But at the same time, Gulf countries complain sometimes that the willingness, the political and the willingness of corporations in the West sometimes is not there to fuel this transformation to the future. And here I'm talking specifically about clean energy. If you look at European companies, for example, you will see EDF, the French company, as leading this European inroads into helping the Gulf economies to transform and transition. But you don't see much when it comes to the input from other EU and American companies helping these countries. On the other hand, you will see a huge focus from Chinese counterparts in expanding their operations in the Gulf and helping genuinely these governments implement their economic diversification visions, 2030, 2035, and so on. So if the West is willing more to give those countries what they want, I think we could see some shift in the focus when it comes to economic diversification. And we can use the example of AI as a linchpin in this comparison. We have seen the UAE shifting its cooperation and divesting from partnerships with China towards signing deals with Microsoft. And you guys published a very interesting piece on the AI minister in the UAE saying that our future focus will be in partnership with the US. These are very important examples that we can use to measure partnerships between the Gulf countries versus the US, EU on one side and China on the other side in many other sectors.
So Ahmed, listening to Zeno, there's something that just confuses me here. So when you look at the top 10 suppliers of energy to China, 6 out of the 10 come from the Gulf. And that feels like a heavy concentration in a highly volatile security environment. And unlike Russian oil that can pass through a pipeline, oil and energy that comes from the Gulf to China has to pass through waterways that can be easily disrupted, intercepted, or blocked by the United States in the event of a conflict in Taiwan, and that if there's sanctions or they want to stress the Chinese energy supply. And the lesson coming out of Europe from the war in Ukraine was that the Europeans, particularly the Germans, relied way too heavily on Russia for their energy. It feels to me that when 6 out of 10 of your energy suppliers are coming from one region that can be disrupted by a rival, That feels pretty high risk. What is the security assessment, in your view, of this new reliance on Persian Gulf energy?
I think it's simple. The Chinese don't have an alternative apart from Russia. And the same logic can go with the over-reliance on Russian oil. That China doesn't want to put its egg in one basket, whether that is the Gulf, African suppliers, or even Russia. But in the end, you can't find another partner willing to provide China with the amount of oil it needs and gas it needs to recalibrate and restructure the economy inside China apart from the Gulf. There's no other country with the capabilities and the political will to do that apart from the Gulf and Russia. So I think there is a bipolarity here when it comes to energy supplies to China. And I think this is one of the major weaknesses, strategic weaknesses in the national security of China that they talked about many times, the Malacca Strait issue, dilemma, and so on and so forth. At the same time, I think from the Gulf perspective, it is not only about China. The oil, as you rightly pointed out, oil and gas will continue to flow to Asia. China, obviously, is the biggest customer, as you pointed out. But in the end, in the Taiwan contingency, I don't see the US blocking oil and gas imports to Asia in general. I see a recalibration of these exports from the Gulf to serve the economies of the US allies, such as Australia, Japan, South Korea, and the ASEAN countries in general. Because in the peak of escalation, these economies or the dependence of these economies will also escalate on Gulf oil flows. So for the Gulf region, Asia in general is a win anyway. They have to look at Asia and they have to double down on their partnerships in Asia. This explains why these partnerships have been intensifying from the Gulf perspective, not only with China, but also focusing on these countries I mentioned before. And the last visit was Emirati President Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed was in South Korea before he headed to attend the China-Arab Cooperation Forum. That tells us a lot about the focus that for them, it's not a zero-sum game. It's not US-China. It's a diversification that serves their own economic diversification and energy transition in the future.
I think China indicated at the COP26 in Glasgow a couple of years ago that before they meet the targets of the global agenda on the green economy and decarbonization and climate change, we will get to 2070. So when we think about China's relationship with traditional energy consumption, so we're talking very much long term. And this is also because they will struggle to adapt their developing economy to a greener economy, so to a more modern economy. That's a challenge there.